Hello, everybody. My name is Zen, and welcome to the first episode of my Star Wars Universe Ranked and Reviewed series, where I'm going to rank and review every single Star Wars movie and TV show. And if I'm happy with how that turns out, I may also do the video games and who knows, maybe even books and all that. No promises on the last two, but for the purposes of this series, we're going to be starting with all of the movies, ranking them, putting into a big master list, and then after that's done, I'm going to do all of the TV shows and put those into the same list and break them by seasons of the TV shows, because Clone Wars has 7 seasons of the show, and some of those seasons are better than others, but I wouldn't put like the entirety of Clone Wars at a certain part of my list, because the crappier seasons just don't really carry that show high enough to put it where I think that, season 7 is deserved to be. So we're going to break it into multiple seasons for that. If you don't know who I am and you're new to the channel, welcome. I am glad that you're here. I started this channel over 11 years ago, originally doing Star Wars content, focused on Star Wars The Old Republic, which is the MMO video game that launched, and my channel is focused on doing video game content, not just Star Wars content. I personally have a bunch of experience in the video game industry, not just as a gamer, but also as a game designer, as a writer, and most importantly, as a critic. And I critically look at games and decide what is good about them and break it down into more minute details that maybe normal critics don't necessarily do, because they don't have the game design background, or they don't have a writing background, or they don't have the backgrounds that I managed to carry and use to my advantage in critical reviews. But I have been uploading at least one video every single day for the last 11 years, and I have no plans to change or stop that. This particular series isn't going to be back-to-back releases. What we're going to do is, for this first part where we're doing the movies, I'm going to do one movie at a time. I originally was going to do it as all of the movies in one video, and I started that video. I recorded a big chunk of it, and then I realized that video was going to be something like 11 hours long. And I was like, this is not going to work. I can't do this for all 11 theatrical movie releases. So it's going to be one movie at a time, and we're going to go chronologically through the story. So we're going to start at Star Wars Episode 1, obviously go 2 and 3, then we're going to hit Solo, Rogue One, and then we're going to do the rest of the Skywalker saga. So you can follow along and watch the movies as we go along with it, which is going to be fun because it gives you an excuse to watch the movies and maybe see them from a different point of view. After that is done, I'm going to hit up all of the TV shows. I don't know the order in which I'm going to do those yet. We'll decide as we get closer to that point. We got 11 videos before we even get there. That's obviously including this one. And as I mentioned earlier, if all of that ends up being successful and I'm happy with it, even though this is a passion project, I'm going to be doing the movie and TV reviews regardless, because I want a master list of what I think of the Star Wars universe is, ranked. I am planning to potentially do all of the video games as well. There's a lot of video games, so we'll see. That's more of a long-term project. Let me know if you're interested in that. So before we jump in and start reviewing this first movie, there is a couple things that I want to just quickly mention as a caveat, and hopefully that will set the tone for the rest of the series, which is that when it comes to being critical of something, it is very hard to be absolutely objective, right? Your experience as a person is going to change your opinion on things, and that is very much the definition of subjectivity. So I'm going to try to be as objective as I can here, but there is no doubt that your experience is going to change compared to mine. Your experience going to see this movie or seeing any of the movies is going to be a very different experience than what I had, and that is going to affect my overall opinion. For example, if you go and see a really bad movie with a group of friends and you have a great time, you're going to think more highly of that movie than if you watched it by yourself and were examining it from a critical point of view, right? So it's these little tiny differences that make a big effect on what you think of a movie, and I'm just putting that out there. Like my opinions are going to differ from other people's opinions. I think for the most part, most people will agree with how I rank these things, but I think there's going to be some big upsets, and if you don't agree with where I rank something, that's totally fine, right? You can have a different opinion on that, and I want to hear about that opinion. That's part of this video series. Is let's create a discussion in the comments of why certain things work or don't work about the movies, what you like or don't like about them, and how that all is thrown into this big old like pot of our critical opinions of these things. The format of this video is going to be, we're going to start from the beginning of the movie and we're going to do a plot recap. It's not going to be super in depth. I'm going to be going breakneck speed, but I'm going to be hitting certain points that I want to talk about within the movie, and even providing little fun trivia bits here and there about either the production of the movies or other things regarding whatever that particular scene is. And we're going to be talking about like politics and a bunch of other stuff in this particular video. That format may change in the future, but just for at least the first couple of videos, it's going to kind of be, I'm doing a review of the plot, recap of the plot. We're going to reach the end. We're going to kind of talk about my overall thoughts, and then we're going to put it in a list. The list for these first 11 movies is obviously going to be 1 to 11. But when I rank a movie, such as episode 1, and there's no other movies on the list, it goes at number 1. Unfortunately, but what will happen is as we add other movies in, that will tumble down, and it's going to create a weird little thing, but it's going to be kind of fun because it creates a lot of tension where, let's say we have 5 movies on the list, and number 2 and number 3 on the list you think should be flipped around, but I put them the opposite way. And then you think the movie that I'm currently reviewing should go above number 2 on the list, but because I have them flipped, where it's going to land on your list is different than mine. So it'll be fun to kind of discuss why I think certain movies are better than the other ones, and that's kind of the whole point of this. And finally, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, because you're going to want to be up to date on all of these releases as I do them. It'll be throughout the rest of spring and summer to get the movies done, and then we'll jump into the TV shows and definitely hit up Ahsoka when that comes out this fall. And of course, if you like the video, make sure you hit the like button to share it with more people so we can get a bigger discussion going on. And if you want to support the channel, you can become a channel member by hitting the join button down below. With all of that being said, let's jump into Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. This movie is the first of the prequel movies, and it released on May 16th, 1999. I was 11 years old. I absolutely remember going and seeing this in theaters. I think the interesting thing with this is my perspective on what the movie was then when I saw it in theaters versus what the movie is now. I remember everybody was really excited about this. And personally, as a 11-year-old child, I remember watching the original trilogy on VHS. My parents had like the special like boxed collection of the 3 movies. And I remember it was during a school break. It might have been during like a summer when they determined I was old enough to watch the movies. I sat down and just binge watched all 3 of them. And I remember them kind of giving me those funny looks that they do during Empire Strikes Back, being like, oh, is he going to be like, oh my goodness, Darth Vader's Luke Skywalker's father and all that. I'm sure I did. I don't quite remember that, but I do very vividly remember where I was sitting when I watched the first original trilogy. So going into episode 1, I was hyped. I was excited. Did I have any idea what the movie was necessarily going to be about? No, but I knew that it happens before the original trilogy. And as an 11-year-old kid, some things didn't quite dawn on me until I was a tiny bit older. So, for example, when I went and saw this movie in theaters, I didn't know that Anakin became Darth Vader, right? So I never made that connection. I was like, oh, that was a fun Star Wars movie. It wasn't until after watching the movie and having a conversation with, I'm sure it was my dad at the time, or not that my dad has changed, but having a conversation at the time with my dad, there's a better way to say it, about, him becoming Darth Vader and being like, oh, right. Like just kind of suddenly remembering this kind of stuff. Or the Emperor, that you see in the original trilogy, I didn't realize was Palpatine in this movie. And I didn't even realize it was Palpatine in Star Wars Episode 2. It wasn't until the end of Star Wars Episode 2 that it dawned on me, and I was like, oh, wait, okay, hold on, I get it. So me being an 11-year-old boy definitely had a very different experience than I did, as an adult, and especially just now having rewatched this movie. The budget of this movie was 115 million, which is not too shabby actually. You know, in today's money, that budget is significantly higher. But the box office, 1.027 billion. So that is a huge return on investment, obviously, as you would expect from a Star Wars movie, and especially because everybody was so excited for this. Obviously, the original trilogy was big. Everybody wanted to go and see this. I remember this little trivia thing. I remember there being people who would go and buy movie tickets to go watch the trailer and then walk out of the theater. Like they were just buying movie tickets to go sit down and watch the trailer. We don't have YouTube. You couldn't just YouTube the trailer back in 1999. So you would go buy a ticket, go into the theater to watch the trailer, and then you just walk out. Plenty of people did that, and movie theaters reported that as like a really big increase of things that people were doing just to go see the trailer of this movie before it even came out. But now it's time to jump into the plot summary. So a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, bam, we get our first title crawl of this particular series, even though this movie is not the first release. And you're immediately bombarded by politics. Now, as a child, as an 11-year-old child, watching this and reading the first couple paragraphs of this title crawl, I was so lost. I was like, what? There's a trade thing, and things are being taxed. Like, I am not about this. I just didn't understand it because I was a child. I didn't understand politics. And heck, I would say up to about 11 years ago when I first started this channel, my opinion on this was still fairly childish. I didn't really understand politics very much, and nowadays I am definitely embedded in that. I understand politics quite a lot, and it is something that I am passionate about with world politics. And I think this is interesting timing going on because when this movie was released and when George Lucas made it, he took a lot of the political points that were happening in the world and to kind of use them in the movie as a commentary on politics. And I think he did an excellent job of that. And it's one of the things I appreciate now as an adult, looking back and being able to pick out like what exactly is going on here. What's the like very connected, but also, you know, deep political web going on in the story, and how do I look at that and kind of peel back the layers and figure out exactly what's going on. It's way more interesting as an adult than obviously as a child. As a child, you're interested in lightsabers and the battles and all that fun stuff and freaking Darth Maul. As an adult, I look at this first paragraph and I get excited now. And here's one other thing that I need to mention before we like go deep down into the plot. First, it is that the opinions of this movie, my opinions of this movie, have definitely changed after deep diving into all of the extra stuff, all the TV shows and whatnot. So for example, Tales of a Jedi shows some early Qui-Gon Jinn stuff, and those episodes have changed the way that I think about Star Wars Episode 1. And many of the TV shows put into context, as Dave Filoni does. Dave Filoni is a freaking genius when it comes to the animated stuff, and he has done a really good job of adding additional context, weight, and meaning behind the things that you see in the movies, which is totally unfair, because if we want to take a movie at face value, we kind of have to forget that kind of stuff, but it's hard to do that because that stuff is so excellent, and it does put these movies in a different light, at least for me. If you haven't seen the TV shows, I do recommend it. Start with Clone Wars. First couple of seasons, a little rough, but you'll get through it. It's actually fantastic. By the end of season 7, you're going to be like, that was one of the best Star Wars things I've ever watched. And you may think that Ahsoka is your favorite Star Wars character, or maybe that's just me projecting. But between the politics and me watching these TV shows, my opinions on this movie have changed. Second little thing that I want to quickly mention, there is an elephant in the room that we need to talk about right at the beginning of this movie, and it persists throughout the entire movie, which is that there happens to be a bad decision made by George Lucas to use cultural stereotypes as caricatures in this movie. For example, Gunray is it's a very annoying stereotype that was used. Not annoying as in the stereotype is annoying, but the fact that it was used the way it was for that particular set of characters. You know, the really over the top like Asian accent that is very clearly a stereotype. That, and then you also have some other characters in the movie that kind of do the same thing. And George Lucas leaned into it because honestly, he's not the greatest writer. And when it comes to things like this, it makes it easy for him to show a character, literally a one-dimensional character in the story, because he could just, you know, fall back on these stereotypes. Are they okay today? No, I actually feel really gross watching this movie at times, you know, just because of these characters, and it doesn't feel right that they should be there. So that I do want to take that and say, hey, this is a thing that I don't like about this movie. However, we are going to try and look past that for the time being. Kind of like one of those like disclaimers that you see on old movies nowadays, where it's like, hey, the people who made this movie back in the day had very different beliefs than we do nowadays, so just kind of take that with a grain of salt. I think that's kind of the same thing here, even though I don't necessarily think that George Lucas was trying to be racist by using really terrible stereotypes for certain characters in this movie. I do think that they are there, and it's annoying that he used them. Anyways, back to the plot. So you have this trade federation that is blockading the planet of Naboo because they're pissed off about the fact that they're being taxed on their trade routes. Well, at least that's the surface level politics going on here. Because after Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi show up and they're there to negotiate a truce here and try to figure out what's going on peacefully, we are introduced to the fact that Palpatine, you know, Darth Sidious himself, is pulling the strings like he always does, which is something that I absolutely love about that particular character. Not only do I think he's acted phenomenally, and honestly, a lot of the heavy lifting is done on the acting side of this. You know, the writing, not necessarily the best. However, the acting is fantastic. And that's why I love the future Emperor as our main antagonist. And you could call this the Skywalker saga, but let's be honest, this is the Palpatine saga. Whether you like that or not in future movies, we'll talk about that obviously when we get there. But freaking love that he's right at the start of this, and you immediately see that, yeah, this trade federation thing going on, none of that really matters. That is literally Palpatine pulling the strings and trying to manipulate a situation, and it's really cool that we get that right off the bat. Another note here is where, you know, we see the B1s as they're sitting outside getting ready to, you know, go in and quote unquote finish the job after Darth Sidious has given the order to kill the Jedi and get rid of them. And when it comes to CGI in this, now, if you consider from a perspective that CGI as a whole was really new at this point with this movie, and George Lucas did a freaking phenomenal job of breaking ground on that, obviously. Oh, by the way, if you haven't gone and watched the ILM, the Industrial Light and Magic show, essentially, I call it a show, but it is a documentary, but it has like really long episodes of it that's on Disney Plus. Go and do that. It is great, and it'll give you a good background for the CGI in the show, or in this movie, and how they were really breaking new ground with it. But I think in this scene, the B1s look really good, and they hold up today. You look at the CGI, and they look like droids. Yeah, they look like CGI, but they don't look bad. Like, the CGI looks fairly good, and I'm really happy with how those look in these scenes. In future scenes, they don't look that great, especially when you get to larger battles where you have a bunch of droids. It is kind of a convenient thing, whether or not it was intended this way, to be like, hey, we have very large battle scenes that need to happen. Let's just make it giant CGI armies of humanoid characters. I mean, the Gungans are humanoid in a way, yeah, but you don't look at them and have that weird sense of like they're not real, because it's obviously like a alien character. Same with the B1s. You look at the droids and everything as an army, and as a whole, you look at it and you go, that's a droid army. Sure, it doesn't really take you out of it when the CGI is bad at the grand scale when they start doing that stuff. And it seems very convenient that they do the same thing with clones, faceless clones in armor, because they can CGI a bunch of them in there without having to add too much variation. It saves a lot of time processing and editing, but as a whole, the big grand army stuff in the prequels doesn't look super great. I would actually note that the practical effects do look really good, though. There's a lot of cool practical aliens and whatnot that look great in this movie, and it makes you wish that they had done more of that. But yeah, definitely a different time. So the order is given to kill Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan, and they get away. They head down to the planet where they run into Jar Jar Binks, which is some people's most hated character in Star Wars. Other people's, they don't mind it, and some people, they kind of like him. I land somewhere in the I really don't like Jar Jar Binks as a character. As an adult, his humor doesn't really work for me anymore. As a kid, it was funny. As an 11-year-old kid seeing this movie, he was funny. I was like, yeah, whatever. And we used to talk like him in school and kind of not necessarily make fun of him, but like reference the character Jar Jar Binks. He was very iconic, yeah, but definitely divisive. And as an adult, I really don't like him. I don't think his dialogue works really well, and none of his humor works for me anymore. You know, you look at Star Wars as a whole, especially the original trilogy, humor is a big part of it. And humor from like C-3PO and R2-D2, that works really well. The Jawas work really well. That humor lasts and is timeless. I watch those movies again, and I still laugh at little jokes that they're making because it's funny. But the Jar Jar stuff, I don't find funny. But Jar Jar Binks takes them to the underwater city of the Gungans, where they find Boss Nass. Again, another character that has a weird speech thing and is not my favorite. This whole like underwater scene, it was cool. And I remember playing the PlayStation 1 Star Wars Episode 1 Phantom Menace game and getting absolutely lost and stuck at this point in the game because you couldn't figure out what to do and it was really unclear. Eventually I did finally get past there. Again, I was like 11 or 12 at that point, so that's kind of a different thing entirely. However, I don't like this underwater city bit. It looks kind of cool, but overall the CGI doesn't really work for me, and neither does any of the acting. The Gungans themselves feel like there's a couple Gungans, like the guard guy, I forgot his name. He kind of works as a character. I like him. He's a little bit more grounded. He's not like overly dumb and slapsticky like Jar Jar is. So there's some good and there's some bad stuff here. But the good stuff is that once they go to Boss Nass and Qui-Gon does the Jedi mind trick to convince them to, you know, get a underwater transport. That whole underwater scene I really like. They're going through the underwater trenches and, you know, there's always a bigger fish and all that. I think that stuff works really well, and I like that. So again, Jar Jar's humor takes me out of it. Little trivia thing here. That you may or may not know. So Ahmed Best, who is the actor for Jar Jar Binks, obviously you can attribute a lot of the Jar Jar issues to George Lucas and not necessarily the actor, right? That was part of the direction. Obviously, was coming from George and how he wanted the humor to hit. So you got to kind of feel a little bit bad for the fact that he just got absolutely hammered from critics and whatnot, and still does to this day. However, he got to reprise a role in Star Wars recently in like on-screen Star Wars. There's this whole thing with this like Lost Temple kind of game show thing that they did on the Star Wars show. That we're not going to touch that, but he did get to be in Mandalorian Season 3. Now, if you haven't seen Mandalorian Season 3, I'm going to just say this. This series is spoiling all of Star Wars. So if you've missed something, I can't help you there. Like, we're going to dive deep into all of Star Wars stuff. I'm going to try not to throughout these series, just in case you don't, you haven't seen things like Mando Season 3 or the Clone Wars and stuff like that. I'm going to try to avoid those, but every now and again I may make references to it, such as this, which is that Ahmed Best gets to play as Kelleran, which is a Jedi Knight, and happens to be the Jedi Knight that we see in a flashback that saves Grogu from the purge of Order 66. And it's a really cool little flashback scene. I like that he's able to get this role and reprise himself in Star Wars, and actually is reprising a role of Kelleran. Again, there's that like game show thing that they did where he is in that. But it's cool that he is there. So, you know, you got to give the poor guy a little bit of slack. But the three of them are able to make it to Theed, the capital city of Naboo, and are able to meet up with Queen Amidala. And this is when, we see Queen Amidala slightly earlier in the movie and her handmaidens, but this is one of those things that is very interesting because I don't know about you, I still continuously have an issue with this where I cannot tell the difference between Natalie Portman and Keira Knightley in like 90% of this movie. So the plot obviously is that Queen Amidala has lookalikes. She has handmaidens, which they are actually super badass. The handmaidens, they're like trained in crazy arts, and they can beat the crap out of people. They're like her imperial guard essentially. But she has lookalikes, so that way she can kind of protect herself, which is awesome. Also, Queen is not necessarily a great title here that they used because it is not a queen. I mean, that's the title that they're using, but it's not like a hereditary thing. She doesn't become queen because she was born into it. The queen of Naboo is actually voted in, and I find that fairly interesting. Anyway, so you have these lookalikes, and one of them is, actually Padme, and the other one is actually a handmaiden, and they swap places a lot, and it is the two actresses, Keira Knightley and Natalie Portman. And it's a little funny trivia thing here, but they look so much alike while they're in costume that even Natalie Portman's mother on the set had a hard time telling them apart. And it absolutely shows, because there are times when I'm like watching Queen Amidala, the queen character, quote unquote queen, talking. I'm like, wait, which one is that? Is that Natalie Portman? I can't tell. I can't tell the difference. It's only in specific scenes that I'm able to be like, aha, I know which one that one is. But they convinced the queen, which actually isn't the queen in this scene. It's the handmaiden playing as the queen, that they must get out and get to Coruscant in order to rally support to come back and break the blockade. So they fly out and they get damaged on the way out from the blockade, and they are forced to go to Tatooine to repair their ship. We're introduced to R2-D2 at this point. Some people really don't like that introduction, how R2 is like the one that happens to save the ship and how it all kind of works together. But I don't really mind. It's fine the way it is. And it's kind of a cool scene where they get damaged and then are forced to go to Tatooine. Unfortunately for us, this hive of scum and villainy happens to be the part of the movie that really drags, and it is one of the longest parts of the movie. Some of my most unfavorite things of this movie happen here, and we'll dive down into it. But they do get to the outskirts of Mos Espa, and Qui-Gon Jinn and Padme and the guard guy basically have a conversation, being like, hey, you need to go get this stuff. And he's like, fine, I'm going to go do it. And they send Padme along with, even though that is, she is the queen, and she's always keeping an eye on everything Qui-Gon Jinn is doing. And the more I watch this movie, the more I come to the conclusion that Qui-Gon Jinn knows. There's things that he says in specific tones where, she's like, the queen won't approve of this. And he goes, the queen doesn't need to know. And he says it in a way that's kind of cheeky. Like he knows that she's the queen. I don't know. It's just one of those like feelings that I get. Let me know if you get that feeling at all. If you see it as like he has no idea. You got to imagine he has an idea that it's actually the queen. But they get to Mos Espa, and they find Watto, a junk dealer who happens to have the only part for this particular ship in the entirety of this place. And they have to make a deal in order to purchase it because they don't have enough credits. So essentially, they land on getting Anakin to enter into a pod race to win to buy this part. And Qui-Gon has some blind faith in this kid. We'll get to that in a little bit, but he has absolute blind faith in him, and then doubles down, says, okay, well, hey, what if he does win? We go double or nothing, and you free him as a slave. And this is one of those plots that happen a little later, but I'm mentioning it now because Qui-Gon just has absolute disregard for odds. He's walking around a little bit like a god in this sense, where he has the Force, and even though Watto can't be manipulated by the Force, which I find freaking awesome. I think that's a cool plot point because it means that the characters are forced to do something that they would otherwise be able to trivially figure out, right? For example, Qui-Gon going to Boss Nass and being like, you're going to give us a ship, like that is a issue that is easily fixed because the guy is a Jedi, and Jedi are kind of like walking gods in this world, and they manage to create tension and stuff by having Watto not be affected by Jedi mind tricks. But then there's a whole bunch of scenes here where they go back to Anakin's little like hovel. They meet his mother. They have all these conversations. And the big gist of what I get out of this is I am really not a fan of Anakin as a kid, as young Annie. I do not like this character, how it's written, and I do not like how he is acted. Now, there's a lot of issues here when it comes to Jake Lloyd and his performance here, and how he basically quit acting after this because everybody didn't like him as an actor in this movie, even though this is not the only movie he was in. It's not the only big movie he was in. But he is just not great in this movie. I don't like how he is acted. At times, as a person who has kids, I go, wow, he is acting just like a child, and that's perfect. But it's almost accidental, because in the vast majority of scenes he is in this movie, which, by the way, his performance absolutely does ruin this movie for me, and that might be a very mean thing to say, but it's true. I look at this and I have a hard time enjoying the movie because of his performance, especially next to some fantastic performances. You have Ian McGregor crushing it as Obi-Wan, who studied all of the original trilogy, or all of the original scenes with Obi-Wan in them, and trying to like get the exact match of like how to do the accent and everything, which I like. And then obviously you've got like Natalie Portman, who I think is crushing it as Padme and doing a really fantastic job. But there's a handful of other characters in here who are acting great. Again, Darth Sidious is the best evil bad guy because of the acting. And then you put that up against poor Annie, and it just takes me out of the moment. It feels like how do I put this? It feels like Jake Lloyd is overacting 99% of this movie. Like he's trying to force certain emotions and whatnot, and it just doesn't work. And he needs to be in the scenes with these amazing actors in order to kind of live in that and let it breathe. And sure, I do not doubt that George Lucas's direction did not help this one bit, but it absolutely ruins it for me. I have a hard time watching this stuff in Tatooine because of that. We are introduced to 3PO, though, so we get to see that Anakin has made him, and we get to learn some cool things about Anakin that I do like, that, again, tie into my correlation between future movies and the TV shows and whatnot, which is that he is really gifted, and he is able to, repair stuff really well, and that stuff is played into, again, in future stuff with Anakin. However, the midichlorian thing is probably the dumbest thing that George Lucas has done in so long. Certain things in storytelling, this is from a storytelling perspective and a writer perspective, you just don't need to explain things. In a zombie apocalypse movie or show, 99% of the time, it's best not to explain it. Explain how it happened. Now, in The Last of Us, sure, you can explain it away in the TV show, and it works really well. And in the game, they also explain it, and it works really well because they want to give you basically a set of rules of how this stuff works, and that way you can kind of immerse yourself further in the world with it. But in most cases, explaining the cool, mysterious thing ruins the mysterious thing. It's there for mystery for a reason. And in fact, in future, they never mention midichlorians again. It's so rare that it is ever brought up because they just don't want to touch it because it's a dumb thing to explain. The thing here, and the most important thing I think, is that in future shows and movies, like we look at The Last Jedi as an example, or actually, the sequel trilogy does a pretty good job of utilizing the Force in cool and unique ways that they don't have to explain because it's weird and mysterious. That's the point of the Force, is it is weird and mysterious. It's like magic. It doesn't need to be explained with science. And there are some excellent episodes of the Clone Wars where, and Rebels, by the way, where characters get to go to vergences in the Force and are able to experience this weirdness in really cool ways. In The Last Jedi, when Rey touches the mirror effect in the dark side area of the island, that kind of stuff is super cool and needs to remain cool and mysterious. The moment you start explaining it, it ruins the mystery, and it completely just cracks a huge hole in the whole thing, and then suddenly you're taken out of it. So I think the midichlorian thing is absolutely stupid. That being said, Some people take a lot of issue with the Immaculate Conception thing of Anakin, and I'm like, whatever, it's the Force, let it happen. If you're really caught up on that part of this particular plot point, and yet you're totally okay with like crazy laser swords and using the Force and all this magical stuff, then I think you're barking up the wrong tree. Like, just let the cool little random magical stuff happen. We need to be more concerned about the fact that it's trying to be explained to us, and that just doesn't work. But as we mentioned earlier, Qui-Gon essentially decides to double or nothing, going into the pod race, and we learn that, like Anakin has never actually finished a pod race before, and you're like, Qui-Gon, why? What are you doing here? Your decisions are very questioning, or question worthy rather. And even like the Qui-Gon that we see in like Tales of the Jedi, I feel like is a different Qui-Gon here, but it does give us a little bit of perspective on who he is and just kind of the faith that he has in good in people, which is not a bad characteristic to have. It just happens to be a thing that is going on here. And it does feel like he's taking it a step too far by doubling down and being like, well, we'll free Anakin. It feels like a plot device, actually, like it's forced to be in there rather than it's something that the character would actually do, which is a bit of a problem. But pod racing, second best part of this entire movie, in my opinion. Even though I don't enjoy it now, and even on my recent rewatch I did for this review, I skip over like 90% of it, and there's a reason why. So here's the thing. I am a huge Formula One fan. I love F1. I love watching motorsport. This whole sequence, all of the pod racing thing, is directly coming from George Lucas's own passion for motorsport and Formula One, which is why Anakin's pod racer sounds like a Formula One car. Like there's a reason why this stuff happened the way it did, and the inspiration is very, very clear. So when it comes to watching motorsport, for instance, if I were to go back and watch a really good race, like I'm thinking Brazil 2012, the finale of that entire season, I know what happens in that race because I watched it live. I was really excited, and that's one of my favorite races of all time. I may go back and watch it once or twice. But after that, it kind of loses its magic. It loses the tension, right? Because you know what's going to happen. So that tension is broken because you know the result of it. And after one or two watches, even the in-moment tension that you're feeling like wait, is this actually going to happen? Is this person actually going to finish the race? I'm not spoiling that race in case you're actually interested in it. That kind of tension is still there for your first couple watches because you kind of get lost in it. But after you've watched it a couple times, it goes away. So am I ever going to go back and watch 2012's Brazil race in Formula One? No, because I've watched it a couple times. Is it a race that I recommend people going and watching for their first Formula One race? I think it's a good example of why Formula One is really good, but it does require a little bit of context of that particular season to make it worthwhile. So the pod racing to me is the exact same thing. I know what's going to happen, so the tension gets ripped out of those moments in this very heavily inspired motorsport section. So I just tend to skip over the pod racing stuff because I know it's going to happen and I just kind of move on from it. It's a weird correlation to make there, but it's something that I like to mention to people that I think the pod racing part is excellent. Not only is it cool, but it spawned a really great PlayStation games that I played the hell out of and I love dearly. Will I go back and replay it and be a little disappointed in it? Probably, but my memory of it is very good. But we get to the end of the pod race. Anakin wins and is able to be freed from servitude. They go back to the ship to bring the part, and then Qui-Gon goes back to get Anakin, and Anakin is all heartbroken that he's leaving his mom. And, I kind of believe this a bit. I think the acting isn't super bad here, but it still kind of takes me out at the moment. I like the person who's playing Shmi, and I think that she does a good job of acting like a mom that's like, look, I know the kind of life that I have to live here. I have to be reluctant in the fact that that he's leaving, right? Because I don't want my son to leave, but I got to let him go because this is the best thing that's for him. And I kind of get that. I get that feeling from her, and it comes off really good. And Qui-Gon goes back to the ship, and they are attacked by one of the coolest Star Wars characters ever, Darth Maul, even though he just doesn't talk at all. I think he's got like a total of 3 lines in this movie or something like that. It's really low. He's just so freaking cool. And I think that the way that he's presented here is awesome. So he comes, they do a lightsaber fight. It's not a great lightsaber duel. It's kind of weird and like up close and just wonky. It's something to do with the cinematography here. Just doesn't work. But it is cool that they have the duel, and Qui-Gon is like, dude, I don't know what that was, but that guy's strong in the Force. That was really bad. And they get away and they go to Coruscant. And on their flight to Coruscant, there is an interaction between Anakin and Padme, where Anakin is like cold because he's on a ship. He's just being on a desert planet that's super hot. And she goes over and kind of comforts him and everything. And this is a perfect time to talk about their relationship. As I've mentioned, I believe that Padme as a character is pretty cool. I like Padme. And honestly, I think that it's the performance is really good as far as the other performances that we see in the movie. Like it matches up to most of those. So I like her as a character, and I like her comforting Anakin because it's what she would do. It's cohesive with her overall character. But some people take this a little too far, I think, because some people look into this relationship between Anakin and Padme already, and they say this is a romantic relationship, and it's weird because Anakin is a kid, but that's not what I get out of this at all. I've never gotten that for any times that I've watched this scene or any of the scenes in this movie between the two. I never got like a weird infatuation or that he was interested in her, because like he's a kid, he's acting like a child, and that just makes sense from that point of view, the way that he's acting. And also he's again terribly acting this part out for this particular scene. But the one thing I want to mention is even if you consider a romantic relationship between them, in the next movie, and then just how that kind of grows, it's really not that weird that she's older than him, and it's only a 5-year difference. Like that's a fairly normal difference in age, but I don't know, people get really weirded out by that. So I wanted to say, it's not that weird. Heck, my wife is 8 years older than me. It's not that weird. It's pretty normal. Don't get all weirded out by the age difference here. And yes, he's a child, but she is not like she is not putting any moves on him, right? It is a simple, just comforting act. Like, hey, I care about you. You're a cool little kid, and we're taking you along for this ride. But I understand that you're kind of hurting in this moment. But they do get to Coruscant, and when they do, Padme essentially goes off and meets with a bunch of politicians, and Palpatine is there and is kind of explaining, the bureaucracy of all of this, of like, you don't understand the kind of corruption that is here, and the Chancellor is working with the bureaucrats, and that's why things can't get done, and the only way to get things done is to vote him out, to do a vote of no confidence. And he convinces Padme that is going to be her best option, which is fascinating because again, he's just sitting there pulling the strings. He already knows the direction he wants to go, and there's a scene where they're talking like in like these private quarters, and he kind of delivers that line of like, that it needs to be a vote of no confidence and whatnot in order to get them out. And he does this little look. It's a fun little edit where he just kind of looks at her for a second, and it's just, I don't know, a 2-second cut of it. It shows him looking at her after he says something kind of cynical and evil, and it just kind of cuts to him for a second as he just looks at her and tries to get her reaction. It's like this gauging of her reaction thing, like, is she going to take the bait? I thought that was just a cool little edit that they did that didn't necessarily need to be there, and probably wasn't there in the original performance, but does show kind of how evil he is and sinister, just always constantly trying to work things for his good. But they go to the Senate chambers where there's like all the cool little floating discs things. I had a toy of this when I was a kid. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember like some of the things could move in and out. They were on like sticks, and you could like push them, like the little like floaty Senate things, in and out. And it was just kind of cool that you had the whole, Republic Senate room. I liked that, but it's cool being here. And then we have the whole vote of no confidence because, the Chancellor is like being like, well, we need to verify we need to verify that your planet is actually under attack because this is, and she's just like, no. And she stands up and she's like, I'm not going to stand by while my people die. This is something that we need to change now. This has to happen now. And then, just with like the little whispering in her ear from Palpatine, she goes for the vote of no confidence. And he kind of looks like, oh crap, I'm screwed. And you get the feeling like, well, why didn't they just do this earlier? But you get the feeling that that this kind of thing is a really serious thing to do, and only can come from, at least this is my perspective on this, it can only really come from someone who is being slighted as bad as this, where she's saying that essentially that, no, you are wrong in this. I am right. Like, you are treating this flippantly. This is actually a serious issue that you are pushing aside. Therefore, because I have 100% confidence in my opinion of this, or the objective fact that my planet is being attacked, and we can prove that, and I'm 100% confident in that fact, that I can then do this vote of no confidence. Like, I feel like that's what it is. As opposed to just like this random thing that she can just go ahead and do. Now, we don't know all the inner workings of the Republic, but that seems to be kind of what the case is here. And it's cool because like right before she does the vote, yeah, you have Palpatine like pointing out like, see, he's not going to go for this because he is actually he's working for these bureaucrats that are standing next to him, and they're kind of giving him the whole, whispering in the ear, being like, well, you shouldn't do this because, they're being paid off by the Trade Federation. That's how bureaucracy tends to work. So it's just, it's really interesting. And I find the scene has become more and more interesting the older I've gotten, because I start kind of understanding those politics a little bit better. Also, as I kind of alluded to and mentioned, George Lucas used politics of the time and kind of threw them in the movie to have a little bit of a political commentary on that. But actually, I think that this scene does a really good job of providing political commentary to our current situation with the war in Ukraine. I think that you can make some analogs here to President Zelensky pleading for help from the West to kind of what Padme is doing here. Like, the passion is very similar, and that's why I think that she acts this character out very well, because the way that she pleads, it's just like, no, like, I'm not going to stand alone or stand around while my people die. And she makes her case very, very well on that. So yeah, that's that whole scene. And then we get to move over to the Jedi Council, and I swear the Jedi Council is so stupid. But that's the point, right? That is kind of the point of the movie, is the Jedi are really dumb. They are the way that the Jedi are currently set up in its state, and I guess this is actually a through line for all of these movies, is they are incredibly ineffective and slow moving and terrible. And, the things that we learn in the sequel movies tie back to all of this stuff that we see here, and the themes that we get kind of in between the original trilogy and all of the extended stuff between the TV shows and everything. It's that the Jedi Order sucks, and they are not effective in the slightest. We see this in the scene that, Qui-Gon is pleading to them, being like, it kind of doing the same thing. And I like the analogous nature of this. He's basically doing the same thing to the Jedi Council that Padme is doing to the Senate. He's presenting his case, and the Jedi, like the Senate, are kind of like, well, and they're hemming and hawing, and bureaucracy takes over here. It's not in the same way, but it does have a comparative nature between the two. And I find that fascinating. They are not too sure about this whole Sith thing, and they even tell Qui-Gon, like, well, if we're gonna need to find the truth, you're just gonna have to go find it out, and the truth is in this hooded figure that you found, or whatever they say. And it kind of makes you roll your eyes and be like, really, you're not just gonna believe him? Like, why would he make this up? And why would he and Obi-Wan was there too. Like, he saw him. And then all of the Naboo people on the ship saw this guy show up. Like, they know, like, oh, this guy's bad news. He showed up with a red lightsaber. This seems like a Sith thing. We need to investigate this. And instead of being like, oh, that's really serious. All right, let's send additional backups so we can really hunt this sucker down and make any kind of headway into this. They're just like, yeah, I guess if you want to learn the secrets, you're going to have to find this guy. And then they put their fingers in their noses and they pick their noses because the freaking Jedi Council is useless. Little fun trivia note here, though. In the original movie, 1999, Yoda was a puppet during this. He was not CGI. You look at it now when you watch it on like Disney Plus or whatever, and he's CGI, and it doesn't look half bad. But he was a puppet originally, and it was up until 2011 when I think the Blu-ray release came out that they swapped him over to CGI. And to be honest, I don't remember the puppet at all. I just don't. To me, he's always been a CGI character here. I mean, later in the movie, in that 1999 release, he was, there was a moment where he was CGI, and it did kind of stand out from the fact that, like, oh, you've been a puppet this entire time, and now you're CGI. However, I don't remember what the puppet ever looked like, and I had to go to YouTube to do a comparison on that. Someone had a comparison footage of the original DVD release, and yeah, sure enough, it's an ugly puppet. It doesn't look good. I actually think that the CGI works a little bit better, but that's just kind of a personal preference. Now, in the later movies, for the prequels, Yoda is actually excellent, and then in the sequel movies, I believe they go back to using a puppet, I think, in The Last Jedi when he shows up. Either way, like, it's just weird that he's CGI, and it just works for me. And then when I saw the actual puppet, I'm like, ooh, it looks bad. It looks really bad. So after all of this is said and done, Palpatine gets elected as the Supreme Chancellor and all that, but Padme is just, she doesn't want to sit around. She's like, I cannot, like she was saying in the Senate chamber, she can't stand around while her people die. So she needs to do action. I like that. It shows more of her character. It shows that she is very compassionate, and that is a theme that we're going to see throughout the next couple movies. And I like that it just kind of pushes forward the story. Like, she gets on the ship and she heads home, and she takes people with her, right? She brings Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. They test Anakin a little bit. The Jedi Council does, and they're very unsure of him, which, to be fair, I think should be the case. They're like, this is an older child, which, I mean, how young are the Jedi taking these guys? Honestly, like, he's still a kid, right? He's still, anyways, that's a whole different other conversation. But it seems like they are very held up on the fact that he is just a bit older, and they don't want to train him because he's too old. But he's very clearly powerful in the Force, and this is one of the many failings that they have done to Anakin. And this is one of the many reasons that he falls to the dark side. This right here, them not trusting in him, not being like, you know what, we should train you. We should absolutely train you. Like, they're very hesitant about it. And that hesitancy starts everything with Anakin on the wrong foot. And because of that, because Qui-Gon doesn't make it, spoiler alert for later in the movie, and isn't able to take him on as a Padawan, and it has to be Obi-Wan. And while Obi-Wan and Anakin's relationship is freaking fantastic when they get going and Anakin becomes much older, I think that Obi-Wan believes that was Qui-Gon's mission, and he's only taking it on for the memory of Qui-Gon. And because Obi-Wan has a deep-seated guilt about failing Qui-Gon in the fight with Darth Maul, that all feeds into this whole thing of the Jedi Council not liking Anakin. There's a couple episodes of the Clone Wars where this happens. There's a whole episode of the Clone Wars, and a little minor spoilers if you haven't seen Clone Wars, but this is, I'm not going to go into the major story details here, but there's a whole thing where the Jedi Council is trying to capture somebody. They're trying to root somebody out. I'm trying not to give any spoilers here. And they do this pretty major thing where they trick Anakin, because in order to trick the people that they're trying to root out, the person that they're trying to root out, they have to be very convincing. And if they're going to be very convincing with this, they actually have to convince Anakin as well, because he is kind of a big part of this whole plot point. And they like totally just screw with him on this and really mess with his emotions at one point. And it's like all of this mistreatment that the council does is a huge part of the reason why Anakin falls to the dark side. And we see just right off the bat, that's what's happening here. Man, the Jedi Council, like I said, sucks. But they get back to Naboo, and when they land on the planet, Padme and her handmaiden go to the Gungans and basically plead for them to join them in order to create a distraction for the droid army so that they could sneak into the city and find the Viceroy, and capture him, and hopefully shut down the command ship of all the droids as well. So like there's this like grand plan here. And I like that the handmaid is actually is posing as Queen Amidala. And it's not going well when she's like first talking to Boss Nass. It's like it's going very badly. And so Padme just steps up and is just like, look, I've had my fill of this. And that's when like the big moment comes, the big reveal, like, oh, I've had a handmaid this entire time that looks like me, and she's actually my double, and no, I'm the real queen. And she like proposes this big alliance between the Gungans and everything. I like this. I like that scene. I think that it feels a little off. It feels like maybe she should have just done that to begin with, but they needed the big reveal, or they wanted the big reveal, and that's the way they decided to do it. But it feels like they could have done that maybe a little bit more dramatically. It never really landed for me. When it happened in theaters, I remember being like, oh my goodness, that's insane. But it's never really hit me since then. I remember I was 11 and I didn't even know that Palpatine becomes the Emperor at that point. So that's a whole other different kind of just going over my head, these plot points back when I was 11. However, yeah, this scene now doesn't really do it for me, but I like, again, the whole way that Natalie Portman is acting as Padme, and the way that she presents Padme, and is very true to this character in these moments. But the Gungans agree, and then we get a big old battle sequence, which is kind of disappointing. And we've kind of talked about how like the CG doesn't look super great in a huge like battle. There is one little tangent here that I will say, and it's that I play Star Wars Legion, which is a tabletop miniatures game, kind of like Warhammer and stuff like that. It's actually freaking fantastic. Look into it if you're interested in any kind of tabletop games, or maybe you're not. But Star Wars Legion is great. It's got a little bit of a steep wall to climb to get into the game, as far as like learning the game and finding people to play with, and then also like purchasing like core sets or other expansions in order to create an army for yourself and all that. Anyways, I have a clone army. I played the Republic primarily in that game, but because I bought a core set, I also have a whole droid army, and I bought a bunch of stuff for that too. So I recently painted up a bunch of B1s, and I decided to do it like the bases, like the theming of Naboo, because I like this scene enough to be like, yes, my B1s in this game are going to look like that. I'll try to remember to put my paint scheme on screen, just so you kind of see my B1s in action. I decided to do a little bit of an artistic approach to their paint scheme, but I'm happy with how they turned out. And then, this whole battle, I like it obviously enough to be inspired to do some paint stuff for it, but it just it doesn't look good. And it is shocking how the Gungans get their butts whooped. Like, it is shocking at a point. And that's to do kind of the whole dramatic reveal thing of when the command ship does get blown up. We'll get to that in a moment, because oh my goodness, that's so annoying. But the Gungans get their butts kicked, and it's kind of surprising, because I feel like they should have been able to do a little bit better than they do. And actually, that's actually a stark contrast to when we get the clones fighting the droid army, and you just see the clones decimating them. Like, there's a big battle, but they're doing way better than the Gungans do, which is not surprising, I guess, because the clones are bred from birth to be soldiers, and they do a fantastic job of that. And when you watch the Clone Wars and Bad Batch and stuff like that, you learn that they were basically engineered to be very good against this clone army in particular, and that's what they trained to do. So yeah, I'm just shocked that the Gungans got their butts whooped so bad. However, Padme and them do sneak into the city. Anakin is told to stay inside of a starfighter while the other ones kind of take off and go towards the command ship. And then Darth Maul shows up, and in order to kind of protect Padme from a bunch of droidicas that roll in, Anakin starts shooting at them with the ship, but it goes into autopilot mode and sends him up into space. I'm just going to cover this whole plot point all at once here because I'm not gonna bury the lead. I think this is so bad and is easily one of the worst parts of the movie for me, and is what is ultimately going to be the thing that brings this movie down on the ranking significantly. So you have Anakin go up to this command ship, flying a starfighter that he's never flown before. And yeah, sure, he has the Force, and he is the quote-unquote chosen one. But even if he is a good pilot, though he has never, again, flown a craft like this before in space, that's a whole different conversation about how bad that kind of setup is here. He still doesn't have combat experience in anything like this. The pilots that are up there are trained and are still having a hard time against all of these vulture droids. And then, he accidentally, because he gets, shot and he's flying in a circle and let's do a roll and all that. I hate all the lines here. It's just unbearable to watch for me. And then he flies into the ship basically because he got shot and his ship is overheating. Sure, that's fine. That's normal Star Wars mechanics of how that stuff works. But then the ship lands and he just accidentally seems to fire a proton torpedo. Wow, could not say that properly. And blow up the main reactor, and then gets out of the ship and the whole thing explodes. And it's like, it was supposed to be this cool, like, blowing up the Death Star moment, right? What it turns out to be is, man, these other pilots are completely ineffective because they should have just thought of that to begin with. Why didn't they just fly in there and just destroy that to begin with? They would have had some kind of schematic on this sucker and kind of understand how that works. And just like in Star Wars Episode 4, it would have been like, there's a thermal port that we could shoot a proton torpedo into, or something like that. And because that's a very Star Wars-y thing, as we can tell from future movies. But like, how did Anakin just stumble upon this? One might be able to say, oh, it was the will of the Force that this happened. That is a BS answer and so stupid. And this whole plot thing is so stupid. I hate this whole scene with Anakin in the starfighter. It should never have happened. He should never have gotten in the starfighter to begin with. You should have just let the pilots go and do their thing, and maybe had, I don't know, the guard character that's like, throughout the movie, I forget his name, with Padme, maybe have him be the one that's leading that, or anybody else. Just somebody to go and do this other than Anakin. Like, just let Anakin be a boy. He doesn't need to do anything spectacular in this movie. The reason he does that from a story point of view, or for a writing point of view, is because George Lucas wanted kids to be able to be like, feel like this kid is a hero and I can relate to him, which is kind of dumb because this kid ends up becoming Darth Vader. Like, you don't need to have a relatable character to kids. Meanwhile, you've got Padme and all of her guards and handmaids. They're able to work their way into the throne room and find the Viceroy and be able to capture them. Just kind of cool little action here, although there's their tow cable zipline things that they do to go up the scale side of the palace. It doesn't look good. It never really has. It just kind of looks wonky, and like the physics shouldn't really work on that. And it's funny to think that, because you look at The Empire Strikes Back, where something similar happens with Luke with the cable getting up onto the AT-AT. And I think that looks fine. That looks actually really good, the way they did that. And then you look at this, you're like, why couldn't they just do something similar? It just doesn't look good. Anyways, they take the Viceroy, and at about the same time that the command ship blows up, they're able to be, what did she say? She says, I think it's time to negotiate a new treaty. And I think that's just a funny little sassy line. And then, of course, we have the third plane of action here, the best plane of action, the best part of this entire movie, ahead of the pod racing, of course, which is the fight between Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Darth Maul, with the Duel of the Fates playing in the background. Let's just call a spade here. John Williams absolutely carries these movies, 100%. John Williams is one of the greatest composers of all time, 100%. No, I don't think anybody's going to argue against that. John Williams is our version of like Bach or Beethoven. He's the modern equivalent of that, and he will always be remembered as one of the greatest composers ever. And this is a very good example of this, the way that the music is working here throughout the entire movie, throughout the entire series of the Star Wars movies, minus obviously Solo and Rogue One, where he didn't do any of the music there. They're just freaking fantastic. And the way that he weaves the themes together throughout the future movies, and it's just so good. It is just so good. So the Duel of the Fates music plus this incredible lightsaber battle make this the highlight of the movie. And at a good point too, because it is the pinnacle of the movie here. It was a really good part to have this be the most epic part of the movie. Some people criticize the like laser walls of how impractical that is, and I just think that whatever, it's a plot device. Let's let it happen because it's dramatic. And if I were running like Dungeons and Dragons, or if I were running a Star Wars tabletop RPG, I would totally add something like this in there because it's a dramatic thing that you could split the party with. This kind of stuff happens in storytelling all the time. I don't think we should dwell on the fact that it splits Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon up in a kind of a dumb way, but it does it in a dramatic way too, and I like that. And the thing here is why this works for me, why that laser wall works for me, is because when Qui-Gon goes down, which you believe leading up to this, that Qui-Gon is definitely more powerful than Darth Maul. In future content after this, because spoiler alert, Darth Maul actually does not die here. He shows back up in the Clone Wars and then is a kind of a force to be reckoned with later on. He's very powerful, and you assume his power by watching that stuff. You would still assume, though, that Qui-Gon is more powerful than Darth Maul. Apparently, not the case. Gets a cheap shot on him and stabs Qui-Gon Jinn, which is kind of sad. It's like, oh, that really sucks. The cool part here, though, is, man, that fuels Obi-Wan, and in a way, that kind of like anger that Obi-Wan is feeling permeates into his training for Anakin. Even though I think by the time we see Obi-Wan in the next two movies, and especially throughout the Clone Wars series, you see an Obi-Wan that is maturing. You also see an Obi-Wan that is not perfect. And this comes back to lines that we hear in The Last Jedi, where when Yoda shows up and is talking to Luke and says, like, we are what our students grow beyond. Our failures are the most important things to teach them. And that is a line that Yoda says because of the stuff that is going to happen in these three movies. And that is such an important note that we mentioned. It kind of starts here for Obi-Wan. It starts here where he takes that anger of his master being slayed and puts this into this fight, which, by the way, we're going to mention that fight in a second between Obi-Wan and Darth Maul. It is fantastic. But he takes that anger and he channels it there, and you see it. It is very physically performed in this fight. But he takes that also into the training of Anakin, and that does not help Anakin at all. This goes back to the whole, the Jedi Council, their issues with Anakin. That's the first nail in the coffin as we go throughout the next series of Anakin's life. This is also a very difficult thing for Obi-Wan to accept, because this is a failure that he doesn't realize he's bringing into this mentor relationship that he's about to have with this kid. So yeah, this fight is incredibly good. I love watching this fight between Obi-Wan and Darth Maul. I think Ray Parker, it just freaking, oh my goodness, he is such a he's an incredible man to watch in this lightsaber battle. The movement and the ferocity at which they are hitting things against each other, because they've got like fake lightsaber sticks that they're hitting against each other, is insane. I love this fight so much. It is great. Obi-Wan gets bested, gets kicked off the edge, grabbed onto the bottom, but what Darth Maul fails to realize is that Obi-Wan is both good with the high ground and apparently also the low ground. And Obi-Wan does not heed his own advice later on, where he tells Anakin that he has the high ground. And so he jumps over, grabs the lightsaber of Qui-Gon using the Force, and slices Darth Maul in half, which is a plot point that is going to come back in the Clone Wars. And then that's basically wraps the movie. There's like the celebration things. This is a typical like, well, let's wrap this movie up kind of thing at the end of this. It's all kind of fine. It happens. Anakin is now being trained by Obi-Wan. There's a brief interaction between Obi-Wan and Yoda where Yoda is like, no, you are going to train this kid, but we know that you're going to try to do it anyway. So here you go. You go train this kid and you do your best. Do it in the memory of Qui-Gon, basically. And that wraps up the movie with like the celebration music that I never really hit for me, but I think is definitely iconic for the end of this movie. But now it is time for our very first time ranking one of the Star Wars movies. And most importantly, I want to just hit on the highs, because the highs are going to be the thing that save this movie from absolute destruction on our list. The highs are the fight between Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, and Darth Maul. I think a high is the pod racing thing, even though it doesn't necessarily work for me anymore, because you can only really watch it so many times before it's just the tension is all taken out of that scene. Again, I've described that through the racing analogy. And then I think another high are the performances. I think Ewan McGregor does a really good job as Obi-Wan, but he does a better job as Obi-Wan in future movies, so that's something to consider. I think Liam Neeson is good as Qui-Gon Jinn, but it's not something spectacular. I do think, though, that Natalie Portman is fantastic and absolutely crushes this role and is a highlight of this movie for me. Now, the downsides. I hate young Annie. It's just so hard to watch. And there are times when you're like, that is definitely a kid being a kid. And then most of the time you're like, that is a kid overacting in this movie, and it pulls me out of it. It's unfortunate. And that is like the biggest sin of this movie, is just the performance from young Annie. And I can't reconcile that. The whole last part of the movie with him blowing up the starship, and I don't like that. I think it's really stupid. And then you also have the sin of the describing how the Force works and going to the midichlorians thing. That doesn't work for me either. And because of that, it really is going to hurt the ranking of this movie in the long run. However, as of right now, because I have no other movies on this list, it gets to go at number 1. It is not going to stay there, and it is not going to get very high from there. It is going to fall down the ladder of a lot of these things, and when we get to the shows, it is going to fall further down this ladder for sure. There's going to be a lot of things that go up above Star Wars Episode 1 for me. I enjoy this movie. I don't think any Star Wars movie is in particular unwatchable. There are ones that are definitely not great, but is it unwatchable? No. Like, I recently just finished watching this movie again, and there were moments where I'm just kind of having a good time. Obviously, the highs do that, but the amount of lows in it, the amount of times I roll my eyes at something stupid that young Annie says, or just a dumb plot point here or there, or just the midichlorian thing, like, it's painful to get through that. It is really painful. So overall, this movie is not going to do well on our rankings, and I think you're going to be surprised by some of the future movies of where they rank. how highly they end up ranking, especially some movies that people don't always attribute to being a good movie, but I think I can make a good argument for them being so. So yeah, with all of that said, we've got our first ranking. The next one is going to come soon enough, and we'll see where Attack of the Clones is. I think Star Wars Episode 2 is actually going to be an interesting, divisive movie. I think some people are really going to like it. Some people aren't. I'm not going to tell you where I fall on that yet. We'll have to see when we get to the review of that movie relatively soon. But let me know in the comments what you think of Star Wars Episode 1. Is this going to be a movie that ranks highly for you? Actually, let me put it this way. I want to know, is there any movie that falls below Star Wars Episode 1 for you? And which movie or movies are they? Don't give me your full ranking. I don't want a full ranking now, because let's get to the end of our ranking and then we'll see where everybody kind of stands. But I really want to know, is there anything actually behind this movie for you? For me, right now, I'm not willing to say that because I think it spoils where I feel like the rest of my list is going to fall. But right now, I'm very interested in everybody else's opinion on this particular movie. If you liked the video, obviously hit the thumbs up, and remember to subscribe in order to stay up to date with the release of this series. But with all of that being said, thank you very much for watching, and we shall see you all next time.